les 5 prochaines années. Et ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production.
C'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, Technoserve a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
Technoserve nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Bénin Cashew Technoserve a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec Technoserve est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de Technoserve, identifié des arbres élites performants d'Anacadier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec Technoserve le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie et le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou. Et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre pays.
Le rôle du pépiniériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépiniériste, nos matériels végétaux performants vont disparaître. Ce que Bénin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Bénin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté, j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Bénin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to the recommencement of the ACA Global Markets Encounter, following the break for the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference in Abuja, where we had an exciting time, thanks to all of you, our participants. And on this note, I welcome all our loyal participants and those joining us for the first time to this program. Let me also take the opportunity to appreciate our sponsors and partners, like the GIZ Move, GDIZ Arise, USDA and its projects, Mayor, SNI, NATS2, Valency International, TGI, Mekong Technical Group, Cashew Machines Vietnam, Intersnack, and many others. Let me also inform you that the whole webinar is in English with simultaneous translation into French. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, there is the interpretation button there, and please use it to select the language of your choice, either English or French. Let me also say that for us, the Global Markets Encounter was introduced 2 years ago, and the whole idea was to make sure that we were able to bridge the knowledge gap, the information gap, especially during the COVID, when we had issues with, for access to information, nobody knew what was happening in the countries. So this is something that we have continued. We have Jim Fitzpatrick as our regular host, but it's also open. Anybody with some knowledge to share is always welcome to share with us. The industry can only be built by sharing knowledge, not by keeping knowledge. So for us, we think this forum gives the opportunity for us to understand better the industry, and then also to be able to validate the information and knowledge we have. So without much ado, I will...
This gap in price, when price dropped sharply because of COVID factors and not because of any real fall off in demand. As we know, demand during COVID was very, very strong, but because of expectations, uncertainty, sentiment. The market that did lose significant demand at that time was the Chinese market due to lockdowns and closure of borders. And that had a big impact in Vietnam. It especially had a big cash flow impact in Vietnam at that time. But if you were to take out that period, and I think it is reasonable to discount that in this analysis, we should be looking at a period of relative price stability for the cashew market, followed by this rather surprising recent decline in price. So this too would suggest to us that we're coming somewhere within 6 months to 9 months of a turn in the market. So we've got a number of factors here that are suggesting to us valued. First of all, we have the fact that the market is at extremely low levels historically. Secondly, we have the fact that the market is trading well below both the 5-year and the 2-year average. Thirdly, we have, looking at the charts, indications that the market should start to pick up, and the patterns are there to indicate that that should happen. And fourthly, and probably I have to say the weakest of the 4 points, would be the fact that we're coming toward the end of a cycle of relatively stable pricing, perhaps distorted by COVID-19. But let's have a look then at one of the last elements from January 19 through to today, through to the Monday, the 10th of October. And that's the FOB price. I then took prices from processors in Ivory Coast for FOB Abidjan, and these are prices I've been collecting from a range of processors over the last few years. And as you can see, the prices in West Africa have changed from a situation where they were below Vietnamese prices generally to a situation where Ivorian and certainly other West African origins too are making premium prices compared to Vietnamese prices. Now, on that the COVID is in the cost of shipping from Vietnam compared to the cost of shipping from West Africa to markets in Europe or to markets in North America. So adjusting that, so the red dotted line takes the FOB price, Ivory Coast, and adjusts it downwards for the difference in freight to try and get an identification of how much of this price premium is explained by freight. And what we see is that as freight has come down in cost, particularly in recent months, the net figure has also come down. So it's below the actual market figure. But whereas in the early part of this trend, the difference in price was mostly explained by freight, that can no longer be said. Even though the differences in freight from Vietnam compared to West Africa have narrowed, the price premium has stayed relatively strong. Now, okay, we need to qualify this. And I need to qualify by saying, first of all, these FOB prices are for qualified exporters. So these are for exporters that have a good record, have a food safety system in place, a certified food safety system in place, and that have a good marketing function. This wouldn't apply to a small processor with a small manual process somewhere. This is for modern industrial factories. But it is interesting to note that this price premium has persisted. And today, African cashew kernels, for the right processors, are making premiums well over Vietnamese competitors, and that is only partly explained by differences in freight. And that, I think, marks a significant departure and a significant change in the way our market is structured. And new factors are coming into play, and we'll talk about those later when we get to the trends. Currency has been a huge factor. As everyone knows, the US dollar has hugely appreciated against the euro, and it has hugely appreciated against the Indian rupee. So this has impacted European purchasing power in US dollars, and of course, it's impacted Indian purchasing power for raw cashew nuts. Bearing in mind that Europeans, at least in the Eurozone, generally buy in dollars and sell in euros, and in India, the raw cashew nuts are purchased in dollars, but they're sold in the Indian market in Indian rupees. So we had a look to see what that meant for buyers in Europe in particular. So here is the FOB price in US dollars. So this again is our 320s, and these are FOB prices for the leading supplier, which is Vietnam, of course. And this is the trend over that period, January 21 until this week. If we then draw a comparison with the price in euros, so this is dollars and this is in euros. So back 18 months or so ago, you saw a big gap between the price in euros and the price in dollars. But that has closed, and that has closed because of this, because of the strength of the US dollar. So this means a major increase in costs for buyers in Europe. And when we look at it, we see that although US dollar prices today are 12% lower than they were in 2021, that in euros, FOB prices are actually 7% higher than they were in January 2021. So this has a significant impact on costs for European buyers. And that's just based on January 2021. For some, that will be more. For others, it will be less, depending on the way they've managed their business. But we can understand in that context why buyers might be reluctant, and particularly European buyers might be reluctant to make a move in the current market. Although the currency appears to have stabilized now, and although the euro does appear to be making something of a fight back, you can understand that currency is a major factor. So we talked about the 4 factors establishing where the market is today, and now we're beginning to look at the reasons as to why it is, and if there are any clues as to whether or not that might change in the not too distant future. But for now, we're looking at significant cost. So American buyers will have seen a significant drop in their cost of product over that period. European buyers will have seen a significant rise in the cost, even though the dollar price has fallen. Very important factor influencing Europeans once the forward cover starts to run out, and we're getting to that period now. So most people will buy forward, most buyers will buy forward, most major buyers will buy forward, and they will then at the same time manage their currency risk. Then they start to look at the next batch of forward processing, either through tenders with supermarkets or through natural replacement of stock, and they have to contend with this factor. Other factor I think we should look at, and I'm not saying this is as influential as things like currency, price averages, price trends, but I think it's interesting to look at the differential between broken cashews and whole cashews. This is an important determination of profitability for processors, because obviously even a good processor can be breaking maybe 15-20% of the nuts, maybe more, and it has a huge influence, particularly outside of India, where markets for those brokens are less developed than they would be in the Indian market. So what we see at the moment is we see a closing of the gap. So this chart charts in the top line, the blue line, it charts the differential in price between 320s and fancy splits, or WS, as some people call them, on the one hand. And so if this is high, it means that the difference between the price of splits and the price of 320s is very wide. And if it's low, it means the difference is quite narrow. And it's the same thing then for large pieces or large white pieces. The bottom line, and 320s versus fancy splits is the top time. And what we see at the moment is that there's been a closing of this differential based on reasonably good demand for broken cashews compared to 320s. And that's happened maybe 4 times in the last 10 or so years. And the question I was looking at was, is there any indicator in that would give us a clue to where prices are going? In other words, what's happened in the past when this situation has occurred? And if we look at it, then we look at back in 2011, later in 2016, and the third case was much more recently back in 2018. And what we see in 2 cases, when the brokens and 320s got close, it indicated that maybe 320s were undervalued and the price started to move up afterwards. But in the third case, back in 2018, it really didn't. Prices start to slip down again. So I think this is probably quite a weak relationship, but there is an indication that good demand for brokens possibly suggests that prices are underdone. But I think it also are likely to take forward cover. So they're much more likely to be involved in the spot market. So if we see brokens moving and 320s not moving, it's sometimes because those buyers of brokens are seeing good demand, but they haven't taken forward cover. Whereas buyers of 320s have taken forward cover and they are working, as they are now, working off their stocks. So we see a number of factors that all of which are suggesting reasons why the market's undervalued. And if the market's undervalued, it should suggest that prices will go up. Now, are there factors that can contradict these? Are there much stronger factors in the market that might say, okay, it is undervalued, but nothing is going to change anytime soon. So we tried to have a look at those. So I wanted to look at the origins, and we had a look at Vietnam, and we had a look at India, and then we started to have a look at demand. And I'm going to come to those three factors now. So starting with Vietnam, we're forever hearing this cry in the market, and we've heard it over many years, about parity, that there's no parity in the market. And that's a kind of a shorthand. What people mean by that is, if I buy raw cashew nuts today at today's market price and process them, I can't make money. Simple as that. So the calculation between the cost of the raw material, the cost of processing it, and the sales value doesn't leave a profit margin. Now, we have to be careful with this, because parity for some people might mean a small margin. It might mean a 5 or 10% profit margin. But parity for others might mean a profit margin of around 30%, a gross profit margin of around 30%, which would be more realistic for a manufacturer in all circumstances. So parity also has certain preconceptions in there, which would be processors' profit expectations, processors' ideas of where they should be and how the market should work. It's also influenced by forward sales. So don't forget that a lot of the cashew kernels that are shipped today were sold 6, 8, 12 months or even more back. They may have been sold at much higher prices, but the raw cashew nuts that supply them, because of the structure of our industry, the raw cashew nuts that supply them may only have been purchased in the last 2 or 3 months, and that's also a factor. So we have to take all those factors into account, but let's have a look. So what this chart does is we look at the cost of preparing Vietnamese cashew kernels, the gross cost, all grades, from domestic raw cashew nuts, and then from imported raw cashew nuts, mainly African. African imported cashews are about 65% of Vietnam's imports. And then we compared that to the average revenue based on today's market. So if you were to sell today, what would your average revenue be compared to cost? So taking 2019, 2020, 2021, and then 3 periods in this year, March, August, and September, we worked out, based on a gross cost of $200 per ton of RCN. Now, I know some people will say that their processing cost is lower, and it may well be for some people, but for many it's not. And we have to take into account not only the cost of actual processing, in other words, power, water, labor, management, packaging materials, and so on. We also have to take into account factors like finance, which are often forgotten in these calculations. So this is the cost of producing 1 pound of cashew kernels in Vietnam from domestic raw material. Highly competitive, as you can see. What I'm really interested in is the difference between the domestic and the imported material. And if we bring ourselves forward to 2022, what we see is that this year, that the difference between processing imported raw nuts and processing domestic raw nuts is higher than ever. And the reason it's higher than ever is clearly rising costs. So over the years, the cost of moving a ton of raw cashew nuts from the place where it's grown, perhaps in Ghana or Nigeria or Benin, to where it's processed, somewhere in Vietnam, in Binh Hoc province perhaps, has got more and more expensive. And it's got more and more expensive because of higher export taxes, higher freight charges, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, and generally because of rising costs, everything from energy to insurance, and now coming into the equation is also higher finance costs. So we take the two. We take the cost of producing with imported raw nuts and the cost of producing with domestic raw nuts, And then we compare that to the average revenue. So the average revenue in this case is the per pound value of all the kernels sold. What's important here is not the absolute value of this line. What's important is the relative change in this line. And what we're seeing is that the difference between the cost and the sales revenue is getting lower and lower, to the point where now, for some people, particularly higher cost processors, you're looking at making losses. And that has been a coming factor for some time, but it's really materialized this year as the combination of lower kernels prices and higher costs have made this really quite difficult for processors. So when we look at this, what would be the logical reaction to this? It would be for processors to reduce processing. Why would you continue doing something that loses money? It would be to stop buying raw cashew nuts, except where you have those raw cashew nuts already sold. And it would be, if possible, to increase kernels prices. And that's what we've seen. 2 of the 3. So those things that are completely in the control of the processors, they are doing. So they're reducing their processing capacities. We're talking here about Vietnam, bear in mind. They have reduced their purchasing of raw cashew nuts, and that's led to a buildup of some stocks. But they haven't been able to increase the kernels prices. That'd be the logical reaction. What would be the logical result of this? It would be an increase in the transit stock or the unsold stock of raw cashew nuts, stock which traders, importers had already committed to buy but hadn't yet sold. We saw that once or twice in the last 5 years. Famously in 2019, we saw a big increase in transit stock. We also saw that during the COVID period for reasons other than demand and supply. Secondly, you would expect lower RCN prices, which is what we have seen. And you would expect higher kernels prices, and we have not seen that. At least we've not seen it yet. In fact, we've seen the opposite. So that would be the logical result of this situation and of this logical reaction. But in reality, our market is not logical, as we all know. What we've seen is, in Vietnam, a certain amount of panic or cash flow driven selling in a very quiet period. So in a period where buyers were, for various reasons, mainly to do with the season, to do with the uncertainty created by the political situation in Ukraine and the Russian invasion, but more actually created by the financial implications of that. What would rising inflation and rising costs do to demand? What would rising interest rates do to demand? So during a very quiet period, processors continued to push for sales. And if you push for sales in a quiet period, there's only one result, and that's lower prices. So now we're in a situation where I feel that we've got buyers are looking to catch the bottom of the market. No one wants to miss it, but no one really wants to be the first one to move, because everyone wants to compete. Now, that is especially important factor in markets where private label, where tendering is really important. If you're competing for a piece of business, you don't want to have a high cost of raw material. You want to manage your risk insofar as you can. So right now we have this situation where it does look, for all but the most efficient Vietnamese processors, that times are tough. We have a relatively quiet market. Yeah, it has picked up in the last 10 days or so, but buyers still have very little motivation to go chasing the market. Why would you chase a market that's at 13-year lows? Why would you chase a market that's been quiet or falling for 4 years? Some of the indications that we've seen would say, well, actually, this is the very moment to chase the market. but it'd be a brave buyer that would today follow this market hard, even though prices look really attractive. Let's have a look at the situation in India. Now, India is not really an exporter of cashew kernels anymore. So we have to take into account the domestic and imported RCN and compare that to the domestic market. So the revenue realization in India is much higher than elsewhere because A, the market is higher, and B, the demand for a whole range of grades. In India, cashews are a much more widely consumed foodstuff as opposed to typically a snack in other markets, Europe and the United States, for example. And what we see in India is the gap between cost and average revenue is much greater than it is elsewhere. That's not to say that processing in India is highly profitable or that it's, as I put here, a license to print money, but it should be financially sustainable. And it's financially sustainable because you've got higher costs in India like anywhere else. Energy costs, importing oil and so on have impacted costs, but that's partly offset by the higher domestic market. They also have to contend with a higher cost of delivery because the order size is smaller, and they have to contend, or they have the advantage of a lower financing period because credit is not a factor in the domestic market in India in the way it would be in sales to retailers in Europe or retailers in the United States. So the Indian market looks better. Processing looks like a better deal in India right now because you've got a domestic market which is effectively closed to kernels import. If it wasn't, Vietnamese kernels would flow into India, damaging the processing industry, possibly even damaging the growers as time went on. You've got vibrant demand for all grades. India is very much on the way back following demand disruption during COVID. And that's really coming back now. So impact of these factors in India is that imports of raw cashew nuts are likely to reach a record level in 2022. In fact, according to Indian customs this morning, it has already reached a record level, and we're only looking at figures into September. But having said that, this gap between cost and sale is not so great that processors can be adventurous. They still need to be very cautious in buying imported raw cashew nuts. They need to keep their costs under control to maintain their profit margins. So those two factors, Vietnam and India, just bear them in mind, and we'll come to the market and the outlook for the market and how that might affect raw cashew nut prices as time goes on. But before we do that, I'm going to have a look at Ivory Coast again. I'm picking Ivory Coast because it is the largest processor outside of the two giant processors, India and Vietnam. And again, looking at Ivory Coast, so same idea. We look at the cost of processing. So I've based the cost of processing on a cost of $450 per ton. Many processors, modern processors, would definitely have lower cost of processing, but I think that's a reasonable figure. Some, of course, will have higher for various reasons, often scale, but other factors too. This includes the cost of raw materials. So similar farm gate price, of course, but far lower costs of moving the product to the point where it's processed. So we're contrasting here the difference between maybe moving the product 100 kilometers to the processing plant compared to moving it 10,000 kilometers to a processing plant far away in India or far away in Vietnam. So when we look at this, what we see is a higher cost of processing for various reasons, partly because the industry is in its early days, partly because certain costs are higher and are likely to remain higher. For example, the cost of money, the cost of power, but roughly the same farm gate price as you would take for an export raw material, even though it probably is true to say that processors usually will pay farmers a little bit better price. I've taken the same farm gate price for this analysis. We've got a much lower cost of raw material assembly, maybe $50 to $60 per ton compared to $400 per ton. And we have, as we saw earlier, a higher kernel sales price. So when we look at the cost over these different periods that we've looked at, and we look at the average revenue, which is up here. So this is the average revenue for all grades over the period. What we're seeing is a much better situation for an Ivorian processor than we would see for a Vietnamese processor at the moment. And that's based on perceptions amongst buyers of quality, the fact that many buyers are prepared to pay for sustainability, and the fact that those processors are closer to the market. So based on these calculations, the most efficient processors, the most profitable processors, should be in Côte d'Ivoire. And this doesn't include the subsidy. As you know, Ivorian processors receive a subsidy from the government for cashew kernels exported. And that's been very successful in encouraging investment and in helping businesses to get off the ground. Those who've made it are now looking like they should be profitable in the coming years. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong in this. That's based on today's average price. If you'd sold below today's average price, it may not look as attractive. If you were getting lower yield, if your raw material was not of the right quality, if you had not arranged finance competitively and you were paying high interest rates, all of this would change. This merely reflects an efficient, well-financed, professional, good marketer with all the qualifications to sell to some of the top buyers in the world, and they should be processing. So when we look at this, what we're seeing is, we're seeing a remarkable turnaround. We're seeing a turnaround from a situation where maybe 6-7 years ago, African cashew kernel processors were generally really struggling to make money, to a situation where, yeah, maybe many of them are still struggling to make money, but it's become very clear that processing cashews in African countries can be profitable. And this is one illustration, and I'm sure there are many more. I know in Benin there are some we could take, and in Nigeria there are some we could take, and there are upcoming others I think we're going to see in East Africa too. So this has been quite a turnaround, and it's on two levels. One is the professionalization and the development of modern processing in African countries, and two is the realization by some buyers, not all, but some buyers, that origin processing, quality, sustainability, and shorter distance of delivery are worth paying for. And those things are beginning to become factors in our market. And they are now expressed in price as well as in the sentiments and in the talk that we became used to listening to for so many years. Now, some of these buyers are actually putting, as we say, putting their money where their mouth is. So let's look at this situation and think about, why has this situation of no parity or difficult situation for processors in Vietnam and some in Africa emerged? And I would say, and obviously this is my personal view on it, but these are the reasons I would look at to say why this situation has arisen. I think firstly, the approach in Vietnam has been poor in terms of marketing. And particularly in the last couple of years, where the answer to a crisis has always been to drop the price. And the fact is that buyers know that. I mean, they know that if there's any kind of a crisis, they're going to drop the price, and they know how to play that game. I think that's also created a kind of a vicious circle. Buyers don't buy because the price is falling. The price is falling because buyers don't buy. And as long as we have that cycle, buyers will minimize their purchases. Introduce into that constraints, uncertainty, prospect of a financial crisis or a recession, and you're going to see this situation get worse, and that's what we've seen in 2022. Second factor is the structure of the supply chain. At a time when costs are rising, when risk is rising, having a supply chain far from processing just doesn't make any sense. There's big lessons in here. It's a big reason to develop processing close to origin. You know, Vietnamese processing based on Cambodian raw material or Vietnamese raw material is profitable, as we've seen, even at low prices of kernels. But based on moving product 10,000 miles, and we're only talking financially, if I was to add in environmental factors, if I was to start to think about what are the penalties in the future for the carbon footprint of a product, this situation in terms of cost and risk would become even higher. So the distance of the supply chain and the structure of that supply chain is contributing to this problem. Thirdly, the simple fact, and this is not going to change, is that 35% of the world market, India, in other words, is effectively isolated from the rest of the market. And that is a choice of the Indian government. Nothing is going to change that as far as I can see. And it's been effective because it has preserved a processing industry. It has preserved a lot of jobs, and it's probably good news for Indian growers of cashews too. So that it is a reason. It's a factor. I'm not judging whether it's right or wrong. It is a factor. Fourth factor is simply what I've been talking about in terms of what we could sum up as market sentiment. In other words, 4 years of low prices, a long period of low prices. Buyers are relatively relaxed. They may have too much inventory now that demand has started to waver a little bit, and that impacts the sentiment further. As I said, why would you chase a market that's continually coming down? Why would you chase a market that's been coming your way for years? And all of that comes back to the disruption of the supply chain. So what I'm talking about there is the significant disruption due to COVID and then due to the knock-on effect of various factors related to COVID and related to that period. If we look at it, what we've seen in the numbers is that efficient processors in India, because of the structure of the Indian market, and in Africa, because of the emerging price premiums and structure of the new processing in Africa, can avoid this problem. Obviously, Vietnamese processors can too. They are the most competitive processors in the world. But it looks as if in Vietnam, it will need some rationalization or to wait for a better opportunity. It's very, very difficult to turn the tide at a time when prices have been coming down and when there's been an element of almost panic among some processors to try and get sales made. So one thing leads to another. You need to sell because you have stock. You're getting pushed to sell because you have stock. You sell stock, you devalue the stock that's remaining in the warehouse. The buyer is less interested. And it rolls down. And for that reason, it's going to be very difficult to turn the tide as it stands. What would turn the tide would be a surge in demand. What would turn the tide would be forecasts of poor crops for next year. How likely are those? Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look and think about those two factors. So first of all, let's have a look at the balance sheet. We'll have a look at the balance sheet in Vietnam, and we'll have a look at the balance sheet in India. So on this chart, you've got tons and various factors for 2022. So this is a calculation. I say it's projected because it's based on estimates. So some of the things are actual data like exports and imports, and some are estimates like transit stock and what's afloat. But if we take the imports into Vietnam so far this year, according to Vietnamese customs, exports and a little bit of domestic demand, we end up with a situation where, based on a transit stock, which has again emerged, and I would say I don't know the actual number, but this is my estimate of the number. It looks to me as if Vietnam has adequate stocks for about 4.2 months. That doesn't include the goods that would be in process now that will be exported in November, but it does include an estimate of what would be exported during October. But about 4 months, which brings Vietnam through to next February. So there's no real incentive for Vietnamese buyers right now to go chasing raw cashew nuts. Look at the Indian situation. I've mentioned record imports, good demand, improved demand on last year. I'm comparing to 2019 because I don't think that we should compare, particularly with demand, I don't think we should compare to 2020 or 21 in India. It was severely disrupted. Again, looking at this, looking at imports to date, looking at, a lower crop, slightly lower opening stock. It seems to me that the situation is relatively good in India, unless there is something in demand that I don't know about. I think demand is good. I think demand in India, everyone tells me, is working nicely based on what's been imported. Again, I don't see any huge interest for Indian processors to go chasing new purchases of RCN. They'll need them, but there's no reason for them to go and chase aggressively. So in neither the balance in Vietnam nor the balance in India do we see any incentive for raw cashew nut to be aggressively bought. And maybe there's lessons there for exporters and for the government in Tanzania when they set the situation for the coming, or for the crop, not the coming crop, the crop that's already arriving. So we've been looking at price, we've been looking at the balances in the major origins, we've been looking at the processing parities. And what we're seeing on the one hand is that there are technical reasons why kernels should be stronger in price, but at the moment, not very many reasons why RCN should recover in price based on the likely demand over the coming months. Let's have a look at demand then. And there's been a lot of chat about demand in recent months, people talking about the impact of inflation, the impact of the war in Ukraine. And, to be honest, a lot of the talk hasn't been very well informed to my mind. Let's have a look at some numbers to see what we can learn from them. First of all, and this is our biggest indicator, exports of cashew kernels from Vietnam, January to September 2022. Down 10.2% on last year. Last year was the all-time record. Incredibly high number last year, but let's compare it to previous years. It's 5% up on 2020. It's 17% higher than 2019. It's 50% higher than 2018 and 40% higher than 2017. What you're seeing amidst the doom and gloom of lower exports in 2022 compared to 21, what you see over the last 6 years or so, including this year to date, is a remarkable performance. Absolutely incredible increase in the export of cashew kernels. These are based on Vietnamese customs figures, which I find to be the most reliable. Just to mention on that factor, so what I do is I take Vietnamese customs figures on the one side and I compare them to import figures, mostly using UN Comtrade or the EU portal or the US ITC portal. And we compare the figures to try and make sure that we got the right numbers. And everything tells us that we have lived through a period of remarkable increase in exports from Vietnam and remarkable demand increase too. Would it be any surprise that that would slow down? No, why would it? Can that kind of growth continue year on year, particularly when it was boosted last year by pandemic factors? It should not be at all surprising to us that we get lower exports this year. Secondly, we had a look at US imports, and what we're seeing in the US is, let me actually explain this chart first. So the one on the left, the bars are the tons of kernels imported month by month. We have actual figures up to August, and we have estimates based on the shipments from Vietnam for September and October. And the lines are 3 years, 2019, 2020, and 2021. So what we do is we compare the total imports to the end of August with the total imports to the end of August in each of the previous 3 years. And what we're seeing, not surprisingly, is a lower figure than 2021, a figure than 2019. That figure is there not because of the most recent months, because we can see, comparing month by month over 4 years, we can see the recent months have been very poor compared to last year. And that July was poor even compared to any other year. So there's definitely something going on. There's definitely a reduction in a slowdown, let's say, in buying, which must have occurred earlier in the year, maybe April, May, to impact imports in July and August. So what seems to have happened is we got a pretty strong export performance up until June. US figures were matching 2020 and 2021, and then we saw this falling away. And if we look at the month by month, so this chart is month by month US imports for the past 4 years, and we can see January was good, February a bit off, but not bad compared to 19. Super March, and then it starts to falter a little bit, and the import performance starts to drift down. So whether that was maybe the building of inventories early in the year, maybe people were anticipating higher demand, maybe they were anticipating higher prices, maybe they looked at the low prices and said, this is a really good time to import something, or possibly they were still thinking that there would be further shipment disruptions. Whatever reason, they continued to import heavily in the early part of this year. Later on then, we've seen a situation where perhaps fears of higher cost of money, fears of inflation, fears of the impact of those aspects on consumer spending cause people to slow their purchases. So whereas it's by no means a bad year compared to previous years, there's definitely a slowdown compared to the record year, 2021. So again, you know, when you make these comparisons and you look at last year and the year before, you're comparing the very best with one of the most difficult years. But if you go back in time, you can see that actually there's a very strong underlying trend there. In fact, this reminds me quite a lot of what happened in 2008 when the financial crisis struck. And in 2008, a lot of the treasuries and financial departments in businesses told their buyers to reduce inventory, stop buying, and trade came almost to a standstill at that time. And that was reflected then in the import figures for the rest of the year. And that may be what happens this year. On the positive side, once buyers got back into it, it very, very, very quickly returned. And we saw positive movements, positive growth in imports in the US from 2009 all the way through. This will be only one of 3 years in the last 20 where we've seen a decline. Interesting fact is that the share of African kernels of the US market in 2022 has increased. So far to the end of August, which are the actual figures that I have, African cashew kernels share is 6.3%, which is significantly up on previous years. So this looks like quite a positive trend within what is a relatively soft, slightly negative trend. But I don't think that we're going to see a huge recovery in US import until we get into next year. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if, based on lower prices, that 2023 itself became a record year for imports. There is also the factor that, as I mentioned earlier, low prices take a little bit of time to impact the market. And also the fact that there is probably more influence amongst importers in the US than in other markets where buyers are more likely to buy directly. And as a result, there's a little bit of more of an incentive on importers to speculate or to wait before covering any sales they've made. I think we should also bear in mind that the method of financing imports in the US is a little bit different to that in Europe, and that too has an impact. Let's have a look at Europe then. Probably in Europe, we're seeing probably a bigger impact of the current situation, and that's not surprising when you look at the factors. So Europe did not have the really strong growth in 2021. It was a little bit slower in 2021 than it was in the United States market. But again, we see a strong early performance in the course of the year, and this is slowing down now. So we're falling behind 2020. Again, based on shipments rather than actual arrivals, we're looking at a fairly significant. So why is that? I mean, if we look at European growth, again, I'd ask the question, was it ever possible that growth could continue at the same pace as it had done in earlier years? As you've seen on this forum many times, Europe has been remarkably strong in its growth and consumption of cashew kernels. That was always going to slow at some point. If we think about it's not so much the war in Ukraine as the uncertainty caused by the war, in my opinion. So it's the impact in financial markets, the uncertainty as to how consumers will react to higher energy prices this winter. And that's uncertainty is definitely causing buyers to take their time and to wait and to look for the bottom of the market before they make any further decisions. If you look at the current situation, you know, would you buy more than you need in the current situation as a European buyer with falling prices in Vietnam, a weaker currency, uncertainty in the economy, uncertainty politically? No, you buy what you need and you leave it at that. And you would be pretty careful. So I think we're probably looking at about 9.5% down on imports by September. That might even mask a greater slowdown because even though the imports are coming, stock levels might be a little bit higher than buyers would like them to be. And they would like to clear those because obviously carrying stock now is a little bit more expensive than it was 2 or 3 months ago as interest rates have risen. We also have a quick look at the Chinese market. Chinese market is important. Last year imported about 80,000 tons of kernels compared to the US market, which was, I think, almost 190,000 tons. So it's become a significant market. Vietnam is 95% plus share of the market. What you can see is that following severe disruption, so we'd seen a period of growth in the Chinese market in imports. Part of this growth was down to a different way of recording the figures. So this jump, I don't think is really representative of the actual situation, but we must go with the numbers that we have. But I think what's also happened is that more imports were properly recorded during these periods, but certainly we saw growth. And looking at September shipments from Vietnam, about 6,100 tons, that's really back on track following the disruptions earlier in the year. So whereas I don't see any prospect of China matching the 2021 figure, which was about 80,000 tons, I think it could well match the 2020 figure, but probably falls a little bit short of that. Nonetheless, given the disruption, quite a significant return of China to the markets. So looking at the markets, we're definitely seeing a slowdown. We're definitely seeing a slowdown in Europe and the United States that emanates from the second quarter, decisions made in the second quarter, and is now showing on the figures. And I don't see any reason that that's going to change for the rest of the year. So that import slowdown is going to be there. That means it's going to be more difficult to move spot goods, except perhaps if you're in niche markets. I think if you're in the organic cashew business, it's a completely different scenario, much more positive. But for normal conventional cashews, spot goods are going to be difficult to move, particularly for Vietnamese exporters. That's not going to change the situation there. Probably now easier for African processors, particularly West African, to move stock because they're that much closer to the market. And there may well be a couple of factors that we'll come to in a minute that might give room for some optimism too. So looking at this, and we're talking about demand, have the fundamentals changed? And you're familiar with these factors. I've spoken about them here, and so have many other people. The big picture factors for cashews: healthy eating, more plant proteins, convenience, taste, and then additionally, and especially for African processors, climate change, story behind the product, sustainability. All of these factors, have they changed? I don't think so. So it seems very unlikely to me that the consumers have fallen out of love with cashews, and they were in love with cashews, and they are in love with cashews. Just look at the trends in demand if you doubt that. But the companies that supply them, the roasters, the processors, the retailers, they may have fallen out of love with cashews for the time being. They have to reorganize their supply chains post-COVID. They are definitely concerned about the lack of availability of a sustainable supply. And that leads us back again to the argument in favor of origin-based processing. And there is uncertainty in financial markets. Have we seen this before? Of course we have. We haven't seen COVID, but we've seen the other factors previously. So this is a business situation that's slowing demand rather than a fundamental loss of interest in this product. Yes, consumers may well change their habits a little bit, particularly this winter in the northern hemisphere. They may well buy less of everything. But I don't think fundamentally this is undermining demand. And if we look back over previous recessions, we see that cashews have performed quite well. So I just quickly took EU imports of cashew nuts and looked at the trends during three very difficult periods: the short dot-com collapse and the short recession that followed that about 20 years ago, the Great Recession, which probably 2008 to 2011-12, and then more recently the pandemic. And what we see is, well, the dot-com made no difference at all. During the so-called Great Recession, there was a drop-off in imports in 2009, but that was followed by a very strong recovery, leading to the trend we have today. And of course, as you all know, during the pandemic, demand was really strong. So what we can say is that demand has proved resilient in previous recessions. We can say, I think fairly, we can say that there was food price inflation before the current year, before this war in Ukraine, before the financial impact of that. There was a certain amount of food inflation. It hadn't really hit nuts, but it may well do now. We know that costs are rising. We've seen that in the calculations for processing parities in Vietnam and indeed in India. There is a question in my mind, and I don't know the answer to this, maybe someone can help me with it, but if people are of a mind to reduce their consumption of meat and animal protein, is it likely that they would look at nuts as a better source of protein and a much cheaper source of protein if they're cutting back on their spending? And is there any possibility that actually a recession could boost consumption of nuts? Other trends are very strong. Trends in health, for example, and healthy consumption. Trends in vegetarianism, very, very strong in the European market and also very strong in the United States. I think it's also interesting to have a look at retail prices and how retail prices have been affected by what's happened in recent months. And we'll just come to that in a moment. So let's look at the outlook. So first of all, I'm going to just quickly look at a few of the big trends for 2023 as I see them. First one is we're going to see more value addition in Vietnam. So I think that Vietnamese cashew processors and the industry in general is going to focus much more on value-added products, packed snack foods, targeting the European market where they've signed a free trade agreement, and that this will become a factor. Whether it'll be successful or not, only time will tell, but it does look like a direction that Vietnam is taking, and it looks like a pretty smart move, I must say. Second big trend for 23, I think, is continued increase in processing in African countries, as we've seen pretty strong trends over the last 10 years. Today, we're looking at more factories opening in Ivory Coast and existing factories increasing towards their actual capacities. We've seen at the recent African Cashew Alliance conference, I was really impressed by the investment in Nigeria, which is going on. We see in Benin the industrial park, and we see the very important existing processors also coming back towards their capacity, businesses like Fludor, Tolero, Afukantan, and we see some small local factories also coming up. Tanzania, there are new factories on the way, new factories already in commissioning, really positive developments there. And as we know, they have a great raw material, really high quality raw material to work with. Expect more news, positive news from Tanzania on processing in the coming year. The next big trend, I think, is that we will see more regulation. We know that we're going to see the ban on the export of raw cashew nuts in Benin from 2024. We know that there already has been better supply chain access for processors in Tanzania. The auction is still in place for export, but processors can access cooperatives and grower groups directly. We know there's more support for investment in Nigeria, investment in cashews, and we see that's coming to fruition now. And we see in Ghana the establishment of the regulatory authority, and that's now finding its feet and starting to have an impact on the sector. So more regulation in Africa, more positive regulation towards the promotion of processing, I think, and we should expect some radical strategies like the ban on exports from Benin in 2024. Final trend I'll mention to you is one which has been in the making for many, many years and which is now coming into law in Europe, and that is traceability. So the German Supply Chain Act, which comes into force only 80 days from now, will introduce provisions that account for not only the traceability of the product in the chain, but the traceability of the transactions, people's human rights in that chain. So it's much more than just product. It's much more than just a technical requirement of putting a label on a bag, for example, and it seems to me that only origin processed kernels can fully meet the requirements of the German Supply Chain Act. And I also think, and people tell me, that this will be very soon followed by EU-wide legislation which will do something similar. This is for big companies in the beginning, but in time it will be for all. These are big trends. They're changing the way business is done, and that's not going to stop. Shorter term outlook, I think lower kernels prices will do what you would expect, and they will boost demand. In 2022, that may not have a big impact, but I think it will in 2023. I think raw cashew nut prices, because of the situation in Vietnam and in India, as we've seen this morning, I think raw RCN prices are unlikely to recover the values that they've lost over the last couple of months. However, if the trend turns, and when it turns, I think it could turn quite sharply. So you could see a market that looks down and out, low and quiet, turn very vibrant very quickly when it happens, because prices are so low. Nobody will want to miss low prices when the time comes. Look out for a couple of factors. Look out for COVID cases rising. We're already seeing that here. That may have an impact. I don't think we'll go to lockdowns, but I'm no expert on COVID. I like to think I'm a bit of an expert on football, even though most people tell me I'm not. But having said that, the Football World Cup, which does have an impact on demand in Europe, particularly, that's in November, December this year, very unusual. It'll be interesting to see if that does cause a spike in demand. Most of the product for that would already be bought, but it'll be interesting to see how that impacts demand overall. I think we'll continue to see reduced processing in Vietnam. It's a logical reaction to what's been happening. And I think we'll see a smaller, more efficient, higher value added industry in Vietnam in the years to come. And I think we need to watch out, because we have this weather situation again, La Nina, third year in a row, less powerful this year, they're saying, but it's had an impact, and it could have an impact during flowering in Southeast Asia and in South India. So that's just something to bear in mind come December, January, and to keep an eye on. So that's the way I see it for now. Thanks to all of the people that supplied me with various information in the preparation of these slides. Thanks to all of you for listening. I'll hand you back to Ernest.
And thanks to you too, Jim, for such an excellent overview of the sector. Let me remind viewers that we are coming to you live also from Facebook Live and then also YouTube. It is now time for the Q&As, and please use the Q&A feature to write in your questions, or you can also use the raised arm or raised hand feature if you want to be given the opportunity to show your video and to speak also. So Jim, I see a question on the Q&A feature already, asking whether there are any insights for the Cambodian market. And then maybe once you take that, I'll go through the other questions that we have. Any insights on the Cambodian market, Jim? And Jim, if you could share your video for us, please. Hello, Jim.
Yeah, the Cambodian
Yes,
market. Well, I guess couple of factors I would say for Cambodian processing in particular. I think, first of all, origin-based processing is the way to go. Cambodia is in a unique position, being besides the largest importer of raw cashew nuts in the world, the largest exporter of cashew kernels. I'm a believer that there is room for processing in Cambodia. I think these are rather difficult times, and I think it is important to take a long-term view rather than just looking at the current snapshot of prices, which the market is currently undervalued. If you do your calculations for long-term based on today's prices, you won't come up with the right answers. Take a long-term view, look at demand positively, and particularly get buyers involved, especially if you've got some of those large cashew kernels. Talk to some of the buyers in the States particularly, but also perhaps in the Middle East for those products. I hope I'll get a chance to come back to Cambodia one of these days. I'm looking forward to that, and I'd love to talk to people about the cashew market in Cambodia again. Ernest.
Okay, and then we also have Andre, who, let me just read what he says. Thanks, Jim, for this nice presentation. It appears that USD and Euro have significant impact on kernel prices. Knowing that in West Africa, many currencies are used for informal commodity exchanges across the countries, how could they be affected, or how could they affect kernel prices sourced from this region? Because the dollar and the euro are also used alternatively in West Africa. So how is this impacting on kernel prices in the region?
Good question, Andre. You're definitely trying to catch me out today. Well, first thing I'd say is that if you're in a CFA country, there probably is an opportunity to talk to European buyers and maybe switch to selling in euros if you're not already doing so. And that is an opportunity. It can save both sides from a foreign exchange risk. Could be really interesting. And buyers, I think, would be appreciative of that. It saves them quite a lot of risk, particularly if there's a forward business involved. I think that the informal trading of commodities across borders is likely to be impacted. I mean, but that's going to be more impacted by the relative strength of the currencies. So a currency following the euro compared to a currency that's more likely to be pegged or viewed in relation to the dollar, you're going to see a weakness there. I would be, frankly, I think that a better regulation of cross-border or informal cross-border trade in cashews would be a very good solution to these kind of problems. And we do see that happening. We do see countries attempting to enforce regulations with regard to cross-border trade, and it's not always successful. So I think that currency volatility is a big factor. It's likely to, I would say, when you see volatility in the currency markets, it's likely to negatively impact farm gate prices. And I think it's something that governments now starting to turn towards setting reference prices or minimum prices for next season. It's a really difficult one to work with, because you can pretty much judge the cashew market, but the currency markets are so volatile, it's really a difficult one. Thanks for that question, Andre, a really good one. Ernest.
Let me say that just for participants, the deck will be available from our website, and then you can also always check out for the videos on YouTube and Facebook for your own references. But then the other question here is about the 18 months moving average you had used on the prices. And if you can re-clarify that, because I think somebody might have missed it from the question here. Yeah.
Okay, hi Lyle, thanks for the question. The reason I use 18 months is because I feel that there's a kind of an 18-month time lag between when lower prices impact at the demand level. Have committed to a certain amount of volume. When you see lower prices, you start to see the impact of those in the broad way in about 18 months. It grows through the period, but you see it in 18 months. I feel that that's much more pronounced and much more easy to identify in the US market than it is in Europe, for reasons of different structures of the markets. You could argue in Europe that it's a little bit shorter, but I think if we take 18 months and apply that back over the price records that I have, it does tend to roughly correspond. It may be a little bit less in Europe. It might be a year in Europe rather than 18 months, but that's roughly the logic of me taking it. If someone else has a better idea, I'm more than happy to listen to them. I'm always happy to learn. Ernest.
Thank you, Jim. I think before we take questions from the other platforms, maybe if you can also address the Brazilian market. There's a questioner who wants to know what opinion you have on the Brazil market.
Well,
what is happening in Brazil? Is it still playing any significant role?
It doesn't look as if we're going to see a recovery in production in Brazil. It does look as if in the long term, Brazilian consumption of these kinds of products will rise. It doesn't appear to me that there was a period where we thought that Brazil would become a major importer of raw cashew nuts. That doesn't seem to have materialized. Importing raw cashew nuts into Brazil is difficult, I understand. So for the time being, my understanding is that this crop is not going to be an awful lot better than the last crop. There's no sign of any return to the kind of volumes that we saw in the past. Brazil will be a factor. It's always a factor. It will be a source of good quality cashew kernels, and that they will be well sought after by Europeans and by Americans. I think we have seen an increase in the exports from Brazil to Europe in recent years. Maybe there's a bit of a balancing of supply sources by Europeans, and that causes competition. Brazilian kernels are valued, but I don't see Brazil at the moment. I don't see any sign that Brazil is likely to return to the place it occupied in the past. I mean, Ivory Coast is a bigger cashew processor than Brazil in 2022. And that's not something that we would have predicted 10 years ago. And that there doesn't seem to be any reason for that to change, at least in the foreseeable future.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Jim's email address is displaying now on the slide, which is being shown. So anybody who wants to directly contact him for further clarification or for further information can also do so. Again, I see something here. Please, if you want any support, it will be good if you can also provide some more information on yourself or your association. Put some email in there so that somebody can contact you. And you can also use the chat functionality, which allows you to engage many more others. But now, Jim, let us look at the processing parity, and especially what you had for Ivory Coast. I have two questions here, which I'm trying to combine now. One seeks to say that it is then wrong to talk about high cost of processing in Ivory Coast or even in Africa for that matter, because somehow, even if the actual processing cost is higher, it is compensated for by lower cost of the input or the raw cashew nut. So overall, the processing cost in Africa is lower than you find in Vietnam and India. And actually, doing my checks with the information you also provided, there is a $10 difference between the Cote d'Ivoire figure you gave and the Vietnam figure. So are we communicating properly about the cost of processing in Africa? And is this concern raised by the questioner right?
Well, I mean, we're talking about a number of factors here. So the first factor is we're talking about the actual cost of processing the product. So that's the cost of running a factory, the overheads, and the various inputs that go into that. Everything from the workers to the power and so on. And that's cost of processing. And that is tending to be higher in every country, lowest in Vietnam. And then we talk about Ivory Coast, a high cost of processing, because we're comparing to the very lowest in the world. However, the other element in making up your cashew kernel is the raw material and the cost of getting that raw material from the grower to the factory. So I break it up into the cost of the actual process, the cost of the raw material itself at the farm gate, which is relatively steady in the different countries, but then the cost of moving that product to the processor. And obviously for West African raw nuts, that is much higher to move to Vietnam than it would for a local factory. And it's the location close to the raw material that makes West African processing likely to be much more competitive. And what's been missing over the years has been the right technology, which is now in place, the right management, which is coming in place, finance, which is changing and coming in place. And once you get those elements together, then you would find that logically processing close to origin should be more competitive. So you wouldn't be surprised to see a situation in which, as processing in African countries increases, that exports of raw cashew nuts decrease and processing elsewhere decreases as time goes on. So I think we are talking about it in the right way. We're talking about it in a business-like way. But you know, if you want to get into, you know, whether it's right to talk about it as a high cost of processing because the overall thing is lower cost, that's fine. But it's not very business-like to do it that way.
But then in terms of attracting investment, the overall picture obviously is in favor of processing in Africa. Actually, that's what I sense the questioner is trying to bring across.
Yes, but it would not be right to tell an investor one number. You have to explain why the figure is right, because investors are interested in understanding why the project is competitive. They're interested in understanding why the costs are as they are, because that's where the risk is tied up. So if you understand that the raw material is close by and it's of good quality, that's a very powerful argument and should be expressed separately to the fact that perhaps your electricity cost is higher or perhaps your cost of finance is a little bit higher. That allows investors to judge it. But you know, just saying we're competitive alone is not enough. We need to explain the situation. But it's true. Investment in cashew processing in West Africa looks, indeed in all of Africa, I know the questioner mentioned West Africa, it looks more attractive today than at any time in the past. There's no doubt about that. And that's for a whole range of reasons. And maybe those are something that we should talk about in one of our later GMEs and look at the investment picture and the attractiveness of investment.
Very good. So Jim, the next one has to do with the exports from Vietnam, where we are projecting from the presentation a decline of about 10.22%. And then the question is, where is this decline going to, or who is absorbing it? Is it being absorbed by the African processor, or it is being accounted for by the decline in the imports by the US and Europe? What exactly is happening with this 10.2%, which is being forecasted?
So the 10.2% is the actual figure to the end of September. So this is not a projection; it's an actual.
It's not okay. So this is more for September only, not what is expected for the whole of 2022.
No, this is for the period January to September. What I would say is I don't really expect to see that get any better for the rest of the year. So is that made up? What is it made up of, this decline? It's made up of lower imports than last year in Europe. Just now, lower imports in the United States. That's just coming about. Remember, the Vietnamese figures are ahead of the import figures because of the transit time, 30, 45 days. And it's made up of lower shipments to China too, and other markets. So it is made up of a drop in demand compared to last year. My point was, comparing to last year may be a little bit misleading when we take a long-term perspective, because compared to 2020 or 19 or earlier, it would still be a very positive figure. So even though the 9 months to September are down 10.5%, they're still the second best 9 months in all of history. So it's not a crisis. It's a short-term factor. Yes, I think it is possibly true, certainly in the United States market, and I'm pretty sure in Europe too, that the African exports have increased. But I would be a bit cautious on that, because 10.2% from Vietnam is a big number. But an increase from 5.5 market share to 6.3 market share for African cashew kernels in the United States is not a big number. Right? So yeah, it's going in the right direction, but the down in Vietnam is not explained by an up in Africa. It's explained by a reduction in demand and shipments to market.
That clearly answers the question. And then you have also touched on it, the fact that African share in the US imports was about 6.3% for 2022. Then the questioner wants to know how about that for the EU and for US.
So the European Union figure, European Union statistics are about 2 months behind the US statistics, unfortunately. So the European Union figure, the last time I looked, which is, that would be July figures, was 7.3% that's off my memory now, 7.3%, which is an increase, but not as big an increase as we had seen in previous years.
Now, Jim, the other issue where you talked about the demand fundamentals, and you mentioned the fact that it is really the case that suppliers are falling out of cashew. Is this something that is exclusively for Vietnam, or you see the same phenomenon occurring also in Africa? For the same reason that you mentioned, the COVID issues, concerns on sustainable supply, which I think should be in favor of Africa, and then uncertainty in the financial markets.
I think what we're seeing is that businesses are naturally enough are more cautious. The economic uncertainty created by the war in Ukraine, following on from COVID, is causing people to reconsider things like their inventory levels, their demand projections, and therefore they're being more cautious. So therefore they're taking slower decisions, they're taking more time over them. And my point was that there's nothing in the market really to give them a huge incentive at this moment in time to move forward and make aggressive purchases. I think in African countries, we're not seeing that so much. What we're seeing is much more interest in sustainable supplies and more interest in developing alternative supply chains. And therefore, we may well see, and we have seen in the United States, an increase in the share for African kernels in the markets this year, even though the overall demand is under a little bit of pressure. I mean, obviously, as the dominant provider of cashew kernels, Vietnamese sees the brunt of any slowdown. So Vietnam, 89% share of the US market in 2021. Obviously, Vietnam is going to see the impact of any slowdown to a much greater extent. Vietnam is 77% of the European Union market in 2021. So again, Vietnam will see the impact of a slowdown. I don't think African suppliers are seeing that. What they may see at the moment is a reluctance amongst buyers to make decisions, because they're in this position where they've decided, I am interested in a sustainable product. I am interested in developing a new supply chain in Africa. At the same time, I'm getting some very attractive offers from Vietnam in terms of price, and I have to justify my sustainability policy also on a financial level. So my guess is that this year we will see increased exports of cashew kernels from African countries to the EU and to the US, but overall the imports will be reduced. And that at the moment, you might be seeing a slowdown in shipments just simply because people are waiting for an opportunity. And, you know, it takes a long time to develop a good relationship with the buyer. It takes a long time to get that trust in place. And therefore, you don't see fast growth. But I think what you will see is that once it's established, then you'll just see very fast growth and much easier market access again, let me qualify that by saying we're always talking about processors who are qualified, good food safety, reliable, good marketing, good communication. These are the basics. So I don't really see a slowdown in African exports this year, but I do see that the growth will be slower than might otherwise have been the case.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. The final question will require that you show the processing parity India slide, because the questioner is doubting how the average cost of imported RCN will be lower than the average cost domestic RCN in terms of the processing. So if you can clarify this and also explain why that kind of a difference exists between the two figures.
Simply based on the farm gate price in India versus the import price. So if we take, obviously when we do these, we have to take like for like quality. So if we take a farm gate price in India for this season compared to the average cost of imports, we get the imports cost coming in a little bit lower. Now, if you were talking about £52 material in India, you could turn that differently, but we're talking here about £48 because we're trying to do like for like. Again, it's not perfect, but what is the relative measure of it is right. We know that much because we know what the farm gate prices are in general. But if you're asking me what was the farm gate price in Maharashtra on the 15th of March and that it was lower than imported, I don't know. But if you ask me what was the average reported price over the season, this is what you get if you work on £48. So for some it'll be different, and for some it'll certainly be different.
Yeah, sure. All right. So thank you very much, Jim, for clarifying all this. And maybe before we close, I would want you to take the opportunity to explain to us what will be the session for the next fortnight and what our participants should expect from you.
Sure. So next time we're going to talk about the coming crops. We're going to have guests from Tanzania. We're going to have guests from Mozambique to talk about crops there. And we're going to talk about the situation in Brazil and the season in all three that has started. And we might have a quick look at what's happening in Indonesia too. And we'll try and relate that back to the current raw cashew nut market in 2 weeks and how things might evolve. And we'll also have a look at the processing situation in Tanzania, the reasons for strong development there, and the processing situation in Mozambique. Should be good. We have some good guests lined up, and I'm looking forward to hearing their contributions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Jim, for the excellent presentation and the clarifications. Also to our cherished participants, thank you so much for being with us. And until we come your way in the next fortnight, we wish you all the best in your endeavors. And please stay behind if you have to network, get in touch with others and share whatever knowledge that is there using the chat, or come into contact with new people that you don't know, or whatever you want to do also in the cashew sector, which you need support for, you can leave some message on the chat. Thank you and bye-bye. So we meet again in 2 weeks' time on the 26th of October. And Jim, bye. Jim, bye-bye to everyone, and talk to you again. Bye.
Thanks, Ernest. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Yeah.
Recording stopped.